The spreadsheet was wrong, and Ellie knew it before she even finished her second cup of coffee. Not wrong in the way that made her boss sweat through his collar during audits. Wrong in the way that meant someone had been skimming. Carefully, patiently, for approximately 14 months. She pushed back from her desk at Harmon & Associates Property Group and rubbed her eyes until she saw stars. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago was doing its grey November thing. Slate sky, spit of rain, everyone on the sidewalk below moving like they had somewhere to be and hated it. She'd been at this job for 3 years. She knew every formula in every workbook. She knew which partners took long lunches and which ones billed those lunches to clients. She knew where the bodies were buried, metaphorically speaking. She was about to find out that wasn't the only kind. Her name was Ellie Marsh, 29 years old, junior financial analyst at a mid-tier property firm that handled commercial real estate across the Midwest. No trust fund, no safety net, no family connections that opened doors. She'd gotten this job on a scholarship degree, 2 years of grunt work at an accounting firm that smelled like toner and quiet desperation, and the kind of attention to detail that made her eyes hurt by Thursday afternoons. She was good at her job. She was very, very good at numbers. What she was not good at was knowing when to stop pulling at threads. The discrepancy was small. That was the thing. If she hadn't been cross-referencing the Q3 wire transfers against the original vendor invoices, something she was technically doing on her own time, for a quarterly review nobody had asked her to expedite, she never would have caught it. $42,000. Routed through a shell company called Belhaven Acquisitions LLC that had no web presence, no registered office address, and had been incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago. Ellie wrote it down on a post-it note. She stared at it. She peeled the post-it off her monitor and stuck it to the inside cover of her notebook. Then she kept pulling. By Thursday she had a folder. By Friday she had a problem. The shell company wasn't just receiving payments from Harmon & Associates. Belhaven Acquisitions showed up in public property records as a co-investor on 4 commercial builds across the city. 2 warehouse conversions on the south side, a mixed-use development near the river, and a parking structure that had supposedly been demolished and rebuilt, but whose permit history didn't quite line up with the timeline on record. The original investor, listed alongside Belhaven on all 4 projects, was a holding company called Vane Capital Group. She didn't know the name. She looked it up. She wished afterward that she hadn't. Vane Capital Group was privately held. No public filings beyond the minimum required. The registered agent was a law firm with offices on Wacker Drive that also happened to represent 3 of the city's largest commercial landlords. And, according to a 2-year-old Chicago Tribune article she found buried on page 14, a man named Callum Vane, who had been the subject of a federal investigation that was closed without charges 18 months prior. The article was careful in the way that articles about dangerous people are careful. It mentioned his name 4 times and said very little about him directly. It mentioned in passing that 2 witnesses who had been scheduled to testify before the grand jury had subsequently relocated out of state. Ellie read that sentence twice. Then she closed her laptop, gathered her things and went home. She did not sleep well. She made a decision, revised it, made it again. By Saturday morning she had convinced herself that the responsible thing, the professional thing, the thing that would not get her fired or worse, was to bring it to her direct supervisor, a man named Gerald Fitch, who wore the same blue tie 3 days a week, and had the moral courage of a damp paper towel. She called his cell. He didn't answer. She left a message that said she'd found some irregularities in the Q3 reconciliation and wanted to discuss before she escalated. He called back 4 hours later. He sounded careful in a way he didn't usually sound. He told her to hold off. He told her these things were sometimes more complicated than they looked. He told her he would look into it personally and get back to her by end of next week. He never got back to her. What happened instead was that she came in Monday morning and her access to the shared financial drive had been revoked. Her desk had been cleared into a cardboard box. An HR representative she had never seen before was waiting in the small conference room off the lobby, and informed her, with the particular flatness of someone reading off a script, that her position had been eliminated as part of a restructuring. She was offered 2 weeks' severance and asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement before she left the building. Ellie looked at the NDA. It was 4 pages. It had specific language about proprietary financial data, client relationships, and ongoing business arrangements. She recognized the name of the law firm at the bottom. She didn't sign it. She picked up her cardboard box. She walked out. She sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes before she drove away. The thing about losing a job is that it takes a few days for the full shape of it to reach you. The first day is shock. The second day is anger. The third day is the specific, grinding math of your checking account against your monthly expenses, which, in Ellie's case, came out to approximately 4 months of runway if she was careful and didn't eat out and cancelled the gym membership she barely used anyway. By day 4, she was back on her laptop, and not to update her resume, she'd made copies. Of course she had. She'd worked in finance long enough to know that paper trails had a way of disappearing when they became inconvenient, and she'd scanned every relevant document to a personal cloud drive before she'd ever said a word to Gerald Fitch. She had the vendor invoices. She had the wire transfer records. She had the Belhaven incorporation documents and the property filings and the connection to Vane Capital Group laid out in a spreadsheet of her own making, color-coded, cross-referenced, footnoted. She was organized. It was her best quality and, it would turn out, the most dangerous thing about her. She spent 3 days deciding what to do with what she had. She considered the SEC. She considered the city's inspector general. She considered a journalist. There was a reporter at the Tribune who'd written about financial crime before, and Ellie had actually drafted an email twice before deleting it. She wasn't sure she was ready to be someone's story. She wasn't sure what she was ready for. What she was not expecting was for the decision to be made for her. She was at her kitchen table on a Wednesday evening, eating cereal because she hadn't felt like cooking, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She almost let it go to voicemail the way she let most unknown numbers go, which was the reasonable thing to do in general, and especially the reasonable thing to do when you'd recently uncovered financial fraud connected to a man who made witnesses relocate out of state. She answered it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, efficient, unhurried, faintly accented in a way Ellie couldn't immediately place. She said, "Mrs. Marsh, my employer would like to meet with you at your earliest convenience." Ellie's earliest convenience was, apparently, that Thursday at 7 in the evening, because she said yes before she entirely understood what she was agreeing to. The address she was given turned out to be a building in the West Loop she'd walked past 100 times without ever going into. The kind of building that had a door with no signage and a lobby that looked expensive in a way designed to make you feel the difference between yourself and the space you were occupying. A man in a dark suit met her at the elevator. He didn't introduce himself. He pressed the button for the 14th floor and looked straight ahead. Ellie held her bag against her side and thought, I should have told someone where I was going. The 14th floor was mostly glass and quiet, city lights through the windows. A woman at a desk, not a receptionist, something else, some level of authority in the set of her shoulders, looked up when Ellie stepped off the elevator and said, "He's ready for you," before Ellie had said anything at all. The office at the end of the hall was large and spare. No art on the walls. One desk, dark wood, and behind it, a man who looked up from whatever he was reading and regarded her with the particular expression of someone doing a rapid and unsentimental assessment. She'd looked him up, of course. The Tribune photo was 2 years old and hadn't done him any favors in either direction. He was older looking in persons. Not old, but the kind of 40 that life had pressed into rather than softened. Dark hair gone silver at the temples. A scar along the left side of his jaw she'd noticed immediately and then tried not to keep noticing. He was wearing a jacket that cost more than her monthly rent, and he hadn't bothered to stand when she came in. His name was Callum Vane. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Sit down, I'm fine standing." Something moved across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite respect. Something in the territory between the two that she didn't know how to read yet. "As you like," he said. "You've been looking into my business interests." "Your business interests have been laundering money through a property firm where I worked," she said. "I was doing my job." "You were," he said, "and then you were fired for it. And then instead of taking the severance and signing the agreement, you walked out with copies of everything you'd found." She didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say to that. "I want to know," Vane said, "what you intend to do with what you have." "That depends," Ellie said, "on whether you're about to make me an offer or a threat." He looked at her for a long moment. The city hummed its indifferent hum outside the glass. "An offer," he said. Here was the thing about Callum Vane that no article would tell you, and that she would spend the next several weeks learning in pieces. He did not make decisions based on sentiment. He made them based on ledgers. Costs, risks, returns. The way other people felt about things was, to him, a variable. Relevant insofar as it affected outcomes, otherwise bracketed and set aside. He had run the Vane Syndicate for 11 years following the death of his father, who had built it from something rougher and less organized into what it currently was, which was not exactly legitimate and not exactly not. Real estate, construction, private lending, things that left paper trails he was meticulous about managing. What he had not managed, apparently, was one junior analyst with too much time and not enough to lose. The offer was this: she would work for him, not as anything dramatic. Not as anything she'd seen in movies, which she pointed out, and which he dismissed with the particular efficiency of a man who had no patience for framing. She would review his financial structures. She would identify the vulnerabilities before anyone else did. She would be paid, significantly, and she would sign an employment contract, not an NDA, because the distinction mattered to him for reasons she didn't yet understand. In exchange, the materials she'd taken from Harmon and Associates would remain private. Belhaven would be restructured. Gerald Fitch, she would later learn, had a very bad week. She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. She stood in that office with the city glittering behind him and thought about her 4 months of runway and her empty apartment and the email she'd drafted twice to the journalist and deleted, and she thought, "If I walk out of here, what exactly am I walking toward?" She said, "I want to see the contract before I agree to anything." He slid a folder across the desk. She opened it. She read every page. "This clause," she said, pointing, "paragraph 9, subclause C. This gives you the ability to terminate the arrangement without notice if you determine there's a conflict of interest. But the definition of conflict of interest here is so broad, it essentially means whatever you decide it means." Vane looked at her. "I'm not signing that as written," she said. A pause. Then he picked up a pen and crossed out subclause C entirely. She negotiated 3 other changes before she signed. He let her. She didn't understand why until much later. The first month was strange in the specific way that new things are strange, a shape you don't quite have the vocabulary for yet. She worked from an office on the 12th floor that was smaller than his, but had the same view. She was given access to the financial records she needed, and not to the ones she didn't. A distinction that was made clearly, and that she tested exactly once, by asking for something she suspected was outside her sanctioned scope, just to see what would happen. What happened was that the woman from the front desk, her name was Rena, and she was in charge of more than she appeared to be in charge of, knocked on Ellie's office door and told her, pleasantly, that those particular files weren't part of her current project. "Current project," Ellie repeated. "That's right," Rena said, and smiled and left. Vane himself she saw irregularly. He moved through the building with the quality of a pressure change. You knew he'd been on the floor even after he'd gone. He didn't explain himself. He didn't make small talk. He came to her office twice in the first month, once to ask a question about a specific transaction in the records she was reviewing, once to look over her shoulder at a model she was building and say, without preliminary, "The assumption you're using on line 47 is wrong." She had looked at line 47. The industry standard, he said, is what people use when they want to be approximately right. You want to be exactly right. Change it. She had changed it because he had been correct, and she'd sat with that for a while. The thing about working for someone like Vane was that it required a constant recalibration of what you thought you knew about how things worked. She knew the syndicate wasn't clean. She'd known that from the Tribune article, and from the evidence she'd found, and from the simple fact of what he'd offered her, and why. She wasn't naive. She'd grown up in Cicero in a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother and her aunt, and a series of her mother's choices that had taught her early and efficiently that the world did not arrange itself according to the rules people said it followed. She had learned to read the rules and to work within them, but she had never been under the illusion that the rules applied equally to everyone. What she hadn't expected was the specificity of his ethics. Vane did not traffic in people. He was emphatic about this. Not emotional, just definite, the way he was definite about everything. The syndicate was involved in things she wouldn't have brought home to discuss at a dinner table, but there were lines he had drawn and held, and apparently had held for a long time. She found this out not because he told her, but because she spent enough time in the records to see the shape of where the money went and where it didn't. She found it out because she asked Rena one afternoon, sideways and carefully, about something she'd noticed in the ledgers, and Rena had looked at her for a moment and then said, "He's not a good man, Miss Marsh, but he's not a certain kind of bad one. There's a difference." Ellie had sat with that too. The problem that she had been not quite acknowledging since approximately her 3rd week was that she was starting to understand him. Not approve of, not excuse. Understand. The way he built a room when he walked into it. The way he said things once and expected them to be heard. The way he had crossed out subclause C without arguing, because her objection had been correct, and he respected correct objections, and that was apparently just how he operated. It was December now. She'd been working for the Vane syndicate for 2 months, and she had not been threatened, coerced, witnessed a crime, or asked to do anything she'd found ethically impossible. She had been paid on time. She had found 3 vulnerabilities in his financial structures and presented them in a memo, and he had read the memo the same day and implemented 2 of her recommendations by the end of the week. She was in her office on a Tuesday afternoon when he came in without knocking, which was normal, set a file on her desk, which was normal, and said, "There's a situation." Ellie looked up from her screen. What kind of situation? The kind that requires someone who can read a contract at speed and identify problems the lawyers have been paid to overlook. He paused. "Dinner, tonight. There's a meeting I need you present for." She looked at him. He looked back, waiting, with the patience of someone who had stopped explaining himself some years ago and occasionally forgot that other people required it. "You need me to catch something in a contract," she said. "Correct. At a dinner. Also correct. With who? People who are attempting to acquire a stake in 3 of my properties through a partnership agreement that is structured in a way designed to look beneficial and is not." Ellie leaned back. "And you want me there because you read contract language the way other people read a room," he said. "And I need someone who'll catch what I'll miss because I'll be managing other variables." She had never heard him say he'd miss anything before. The dinner was at a private room in a restaurant she had never been able to afford, with 4 men whose suits were impeccable and whose smiles were the specific professional warmth of people who expected to win. Vane was different in that context, contained, controlled, the temperature in the room adjusting subtly around him. He introduced her only as his financial advisor, which was not entirely untrue. She read the contract summary over the appetizers. She found the problem in the equity dilution clause before the entrees arrived. She wrote a note on a small piece of paper. She'd brought her own paper, because she'd known somehow that this was the kind of evening that required paper, and set it on the table in front of him without drawing attention to the gesture. He read it. He looked at her once, briefly, with an expression she still couldn't name. He renegotiated the clause over dessert. The 4 men left with what they'd come for minus the thing they'd been counting on, and they would not realize what they'd lost until their lawyers reviewed the final agreement 3 days later. In the car afterward, his car a dark sedan that moved through the city with more quiet than cars usually managed. Vane said the dilution clause wasn't the only problem. No, Ellie said. There was also something in the arbitration language, but that one was less urgent. Less urgent. It would have taken them 2 years to invoke it. You have time to fix it. He was quiet for a moment. I'll have it corrected tomorrow, he said. I know, she said, before she'd thought about whether she should. Outside the window, the city moved past, all lit up and indifferent. Chicago in December, which she had always thought, was either very beautiful or very brutal, depending on which way the wind was coming off the lake, and tonight it was beautiful in that particular way that felt like it was happening at her specifically. She was aware of the exact amount of space between her shoulder and his in the back of that car. She was also aware that she was aware of it, and that this was not a new awareness, just one she'd been managing. Marsh, he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the same careful, assessing look he'd given her the first night in the office, but it was different now. Something underneath it that he hadn't had then, or hadn't let show. I want to be clear about something, he said. Go ahead, she said, because she had learned that with Vane, you let him say what he was going to say. This arrangement, he said, has become something I did not account for. She waited. I account for most things, he said. I know you are. He stopped. He looked out the window and then back at her. You are not what I expected you to be. Ellie thought about this. She thought about the spreadsheet where she'd first found Belhaven. She thought about the car park where she'd sat for 11 minutes after losing her job, trying to figure out what she was going to do. She thought about the contract on his desk that she'd actually read before she'd signed, and the pen crossing out subclause C, and 3 other changes she'd negotiated because she'd been too tired and too angry and too broke to pretend she had less leverage than she did. She thought about Rena saying, he's not a good man, but he's not a certain kind of bad one. I'm going to need you to be more specific, she said. What did you expect me to be? Someone I could contain, he said. Someone manageable. And instead, he turned to look at her again, and this time she didn't look away. Instead, he said, I find you are the only person in this city whose judgment I am inclined to trust. Which was not, she thought, the same as a declaration. Which was not, she thought, something either of them was ready to call what it was. But it was Callum Vane saying something he hadn't calculated in advance, and she had worked with him long enough to know how rare that was. To know what it cost him to say a thing without knowing exactly how it would land. That's a problem, she said carefully, given the nature of our arrangement. Yes, he said. What are you going to do about it? He didn't answer immediately. Outside, the city did what cities do, which is keep going regardless. I haven't decided yet, he said, and something in his voice was different. The same voice she'd heard say 100 things with total certainty, and now carrying the sound of a man who had reached the edge of his ledger and found a question he hadn't written down. She did not tell him that she hadn't decided either. She didn't need to. He was a man who read what wasn't said as readily as what was, and she was done pretending she couldn't do the same. The car stopped in front of her building. She got out. She looked back at him through the open door. The dark interior, the city lights catching the silver at his temples, the scar on his jaw she had long since stopped trying not to notice. The arbitration clause, she said. I'll send you a revised version in the morning. I expect you will, he said. She shut the door. She walked into her building. She took the elevator up to her floor and unlocked her apartment and set her bag down on the kitchen table, next to the cereal bowl she still hadn't washed from that morning. She sat down. She was aware that her hands were entirely steady, which surprised her, and that the steadiness was not the absence of feeling, but something more like its center. The place where you've been afraid for long enough that you've started to locate, somewhere, beneath the fear, the outline of what you actually want. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. An email from his address, his personal address, not the business one, sent at 11:47 p.m. subject line blank, containing 2 words. Tomorrow. Early. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she typed back, how early? His response came in under a minute. 7. I'll have coffee. She set the phone face down on the table. She was not smiling, exactly. She was something else, something she didn't have a clean word for, that felt like standing at the beginning of a thing rather than the end of one, and knowing it and not running. She was not someone who ran. She never had been. It was perhaps the only thing she and Callum Vane had in common before they had anything else. She pulled her laptop toward her and opened the arbitration clause.